Now that we've got our client side working nicely with Vue, it's time to start building the back end of our blog, and to do this, we're going to be using Node.js. Now, you've probably already heard about Node.js by now, and it's very important. Because it allows us to write our backend in JavaScript instead of in PHP or Python or Java. Now, this is great news for JavaScript developers, because it means that with a single language, we can develop both the front end and back end of our site. Now, there are many different libraries that can be used to write basic servers on Node.js, and the one that we're going to be using in these videos is called Express. Now, Express is a great choice for us, because it's unopinionated, it's very easy to get started with. And it's also very well documented, and as an added bonus, there are also a ton of third-party add-ons that can be used to extend its functionality. So without further ado, let's get started building our backend with Node.js and Express. To get started creating a backend for our app with Node.js and Express, what we're going to do first is create a new directory outside of our frontend directory, right? So, earlier we created this Vue project called frontend in our directory. And next to it we're going to create a new folder now called backend. Alright, now, unlike with our front-end code where we had to use the Vue CLI to generate a new project for ourselves. With the back-end code, setting up an Express app is actually pretty easy where we can just do it ourselves. So, that's what we're going to do here. And what you're going to want to do is open up a new terminal, and what we're going to do actually is just stop our front-end application, which you can do with Ctrl+C. And once you've done that, we're going to want to change directories into the backend directory. So assuming that you're already in the frontend directory, you should be able to say cd/backend, right? That takes us up one level and goes into the backend directory. Cool. So, now that we're in the backend directory, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a new npm package by running the command npm init y, and you're going to want to hit enter. Now, what that's going to do for us is it's going to create a new package.json file inside our folder. And you can take a look at the contents of that if you want. But anyway, once you've created that new package.json file, what you're going to want to do is run the command npm install express, and this will install the Express library into our backend project for us. And definitely make sure that you're running this command inside the backend folder, since that will make a difference later on when we go to actually use the Express package. So you should see this node modules folder up here under backend, as well as this packagelock.json file. Cool. So now that we've done that, the next thing that we're going to do is create a new folder inside backend called source. And this will just be the folder that we put all of our source code inside of. So inside there now, we're going to create a new file, and we'll call that file server.js. And this file is going to be the entry point for the backend of our app where we set up our server code and run it. However, before we actually jump in and start writing code in this file, there's something we need to do first, right? Because when we're creating a Node.js server, we want to have access to the most up-to-date syntax of JavaScript available. And the easiest way for us to do that is to use a library called Babel. And Babel is used in Vue as well, right? That's why we have this Babel config file. So, what we're going to want to do is in our backend, we're going to install a number of different packages. So, just bear with me here. We're going to say npm install, and then we're going to say save dev. And after that we're going to say at babel/core at babel/node at babel/preset end at babel/cli and at babel/plugin transform runtime. Okay. And then we're going to hit enter, and all of those packages will be installed. You're going to want to make sure you have those typed exactly right before hitting enter too, by the way. And once we've done that, there's one more package that we're going to install. We're going to say npm install at babel/runtime. Cool. So, now that we've done all of that, the next thing that we're going to do is inside our backend directory, we're going to create a new file which we'll call .babelk. And the name of this is very important as well. So make sure you name it that. And then inside of here, we're going to put a configuration object. So, we're going to start with curly braces. This is going to have a property called presets, and the value for that is going to be an array with the string at babel/preset.env inside of it. And once we've added that, we're also going to say plugins. And the value for this is going to be an array with another array inside of it. And this might be a little bit confusing. Don't worry too much about why we're doing all of this. Just know that it will allow us to have access to the most up-to-date version of JavaScript available here. So inside there, we're going to say as a string at babel/plugin-transform-runtime. And then as the second element in this array, we're going to say regenerator. And the value for that is going to be true. So again, lots of stuff that we had to type there. Don't worry what this all does. Just know that we need this configuration for later. Cool. So, now that we have that, we're free to start writing our server file. So, we're going to close this babelk file and open up server.js inside our source directory. And here's what setting up an Express server is going to look like. It's actually very simple. We're going to say import Express from Express, and then we're going to say const app equals Express. And that's going to be followed by where we tell our app to listen. And that's going to look like this. We're going to say app listen. And the first argument to this function is the port that we want our server to listen on. We're just going to use 8000 here. And the second argument is a callback that will get called when our server is up and running. So what we're going to do is inside there, we're just going to say console.log and log out the message. Server is listening on port 8000. Cool. So at this point, if we were to run our server would start listening, but it wouldn't actually respond to any of our requests. So, what we're going to need to do next is add something called an endpoint. Now, an endpoint is basically just logic that we want our server to execute when it receives a specific type of request. So, here's what our first server endpoint is going to look like. It's just going to be a simplistic example to demonstrate how Express endpoints work. What we're going to do is say app-get. The first argument here is going to be /hello. And then the second argument is going to be a callback function with two arguments called request and response. We'll talk about those in more detail later. And then, inside the body of this callback function, we're just going to say response.send. And we're going to send back the string hello. Okay? So, that's a very simple Express server. And what we're going to do next is run this server. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to type the command npx babel node, and then the path to our file, which is going to be source/server.js. And if we hit enter now, what we should see is the message, server is listening on port 8000, is going to be logged out to the console. Okay, so if we go now to our ports tab, and this is only relevant if you're using Codespaces, by the way. If you're using VS Code, you're going to want to send your requests to localhost 8000. But since we're using Codespaces here, we're going to go to ports, and you'll see that we now have a new port here, and that is 8000. That's where our backend is now listening on. So, if you want to send a request to the backend, what you're going to want to do is click on this little world icon. And the first thing you're going to see come up is this message that says cannot get /. What you're going to want to do after that is add /hello onto the end of it. And if you hit enter, sure enough, you'll see that it says, hello. And this is the response that our server sent back. So, what we did here is we created a server, we started it up, and when you start up a server, it's basically just going to sit there listening for requests. And then what we did is we sent a request to our server. And again, since we're in Codespaces we had to let Codespaces do the forwarding for us. And this sent a request to our server. Our server triggered this logic here in response to that request, and it sent back the string, hello, to the client side which was displayed here. So anyway, that's how to set up a basic Express server and send requests to it. And what we've seen here is going to form the basis for all of our real server endpoints we'll create for our app. Alright, so we've seen how to set up and run an Express server, and as we move forward with our server development from now on it's going to be very important for us to have an easy and reliable way to test it. So far we've tested our server just by sending a request to the right endpoint using our browser. And that works, but for some of the more complicated operations, we're going to want to implement here. This won't be quite enough. Testing using the browser isn't going to work quite as well as we need it to. So what a lot of people do to test their backend is they use a tool called Postman, which is what we're going to be using here. And Postman is basically just a nice program that allows you to custom create different requests and see what happens when you send these requests to the server. So what you're going to want to do if you don't already have Postman is go to postman.com/downloads. And the URL may change. So you can always just Google, download Postman, if you're not sure where to find it. And you're going to want to download this for whatever your current operating system is. And in case you're on a Mac and don't know whether you're Intel chip or Apple chip, you can always just go up to the top here and click on About this Mac, and you should be able to see that in the description. Now, in my case, I have Mac Intel chip, so I'm going to download that here. And once that finishes downloading, we're going to run the installer. And actually, as a matter of fact it's not an installer at all, but a program. So I'm going to run that program and we should see that come up here in just a minute. And there we go. Your Postman application should look something like what you see here. They're always changing it nowadays. So you might see something a little bit different. But anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to send a request. So you're going to want to find wherever on the interface there's an option to do something like send a request. You're going to want to just click on that. So that brings up a tab that looks like this. And just as another side note, Postman seems to be making you sign in from now on. So you're just going to need to sign in using something like a Gmail account, if you want to use it, unfortunately. Cool, so anyway. Now that we have Postman downloaded and running, let's take a look at how to use Postman to send requests to our server. So sending requests using Postman is pretty straightforward, but if you're using Codespaces, there's going to be an extra step that you're going to have to do in order to make sure it works correctly. Now, if you're developing locally, first of all, and you have your server running on, let's say, localhost port 8000, then sending a request to your server is pretty simple. You just say http://localhost 8000. And then you can add whatever the endpoint path is after that. So, if we wanted to send this to /hello, you could add /hello. However, in our case, since we're developing this on Codespaces, not only are we going to have to get the URL that our Codespaces server is running on, so that's this URL that you see here, but we're also going to have to make sure that our server's port is made public. Because right now, if we just try and copy this URL and paste it in Postman, if we click send, we're going to see that we get back a response that basically is just an error telling us that we can't access that port. So in order to make this port public, what we're going to need to do is go back to Codespaces, open this ports tab. And then we're going to need to go over to the visibility column here. And then, if we right-click and click on port visibility, we can change that to public by selecting public from the drop-down. Cool, so that's going to take a moment to restart there. Once it turns public and shows back up with that little visibility public underneath it, we should be able to now send that same request from Postman again. And after a second or two, we should see the response, hello, which is the same response that we got earlier. So anyway, that's how to download and run Postman, and send requests to a Codespaces server. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to start creating endpoints for our full-stack application. Alright, so at this point we have a basic server setup and we have Postman, which is really going to help us test our different server endpoints. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at how to start creating some endpoints on our server that will be useful to our full-stack application, right? So what we're going to start off with are 3 important endpoints that will allow our front end eventually to load data from our server. Now, these 3 endpoints are going to look like this. The first endpoint is going to be an endpoint for loading all of the products. So for that we're going to say app-get lkv and the endpoint for that is going to be /products, and we'll see how to implement this in just a second. But the callback is going to look the same for all of these. We're going to have request and response, which again we'll talk about in more detail shortly. The next endpoint that we're going to create will be an endpoint for loading the user's current shopping cart. So that's going to look like this. We're going to say app-get /cart. And last but not least, we're going to say app-get. And this is going to be an endpoint for loading individual products by their ID. So this is going to look an awful lot like the basic page setup that we had on our front end, where we had the cart route for our shopping cart page, the products route for our products page, and the individual product route with that little URL parameter for the product detail page. So this is going to be the endpoint for the product detail, and the path for that is going to be /products/ and then we're going to say producted. And this right here is going to do pretty much the same thing as what we saw on the front end. It's going to allow us to pass different values for this and then access those values to determine which product we're going to respond with. Cool, so now that we have those 3 endpoints, we should be able to start implementing these. The first endpoint is going to be for sending back all of the products. And in order to get all of the products that we'll want to send back to the client side, what we're going to need to do is go into the front end. Open up that temp data file and we're going to copy this export const products thing. So I'm just going to copy this, and in fact, we can even just use the entire temp data file, if we say copy and then paste that inside our backend source directory. We're going to say paste, and there are a few things that we'll have to change, right? We're going to want to remove these imports for now, we'll just comment those out. And we'll also want to temporarily comment out the image and name on each of these cart items, okay. So the backend deals with images in a slightly different way than Vue applications do. So we'll just remove the image name from all of these just by commenting it out temporarily. And once we've done that, we should be able to use this data in our server. So let's close that and head back to our server.js file. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say import, and we're going to import the cart items as well as the products from our temp data file. Cool. So now all we have to do, if we want to send back the products or cart items or whatever to the user, is just like earlier when we said response.sendHello. And we were able to just send back a simple string that was received by the front end with our products endpoint, card endpoint, and so on. We can just send back basic JavaScript data by saying response.send. And then, if we want to send back the products here, we say products. Now, one minor difference here is that generally it's considered a good idea, if you're sending back JSON data specifically, to say response.json instead of response.send. So that's what we're going to use in this case. And for the cart, all we have to do now is say response.json cart items, and that will send that back to the client. And for the individual product, here's where we're going to have to add a little bit of logic, but nothing we haven't seen before. We're going to need to find the product corresponding to this product ID URL parameter, and that's going to look like this. We're going to say const product equals products.find, all right. So we're using that same find method that we used earlier on our front end when we wanted to find the matching product for an ID. And in order to obviously find the product that matches this ID, we first have to get the value of that ID in this endpoint. Now the way that you do that in Express is going to look like this. We're going to say const product ID equals request.params, alright, so this params property is automatically included on this request argument. Which by the way includes a lot of other information about the request that was just received, such as any extra information that was included with the request, and even things like the exact path that the request was sent to. So we're going to say request.params.productID. And what that'll do is it'll take the value that's at this part of the path and it will allow us to get that as a variable. So if we had called this something like my URL parameter, we would need to say my URL parameter as the property name down here. But anyway, we'll just leave that as product ID. And now that we have the product ID, of course, we're going to want to say products.findLKV and we'll want to find the product whose ID, right, product.id is equal to the product ID URL parameter that we got up above. Okay, and now that we have the product, we're just going to say response.jsonLKV and send that product back to the client side. And that looks like what we just typed out there, response.json product. So now, if we want to test out these endpoints, what we're going to need to do is restart our server. And you will have to do this even if the server is already running because Express servers don't update by default when we make changes to the server file. We will see shortly how to make that happen, but it won't right now. So we're just going to need to rerun our server with npx babel node and then source/server.js and hit enter. And we should see that our server starts up and says server is listening on port 8000. So let's do the same thing that we did before. We're going to need to go into ports and make sure that port is public. Alright, and this is another reason why we're definitely going to want to make sure our server automatically restarts so that we don't have to do this each and every time. So let's right-click on this and we're going to say port visibility public, and now we should be able to send requests to these three endpoints from Postman. So let's try sending a request first of all to /products. And if we click send, sure enough, we'll see all of our products get sent back as part of the response, which is exactly what we wanted. If we try cart now and click send, then sure enough we'll see all of the products that are in our cart. And for the last endpoint, we're going to say products/123. And if we click send, we should see only the product with ID 123 get sent back to us. So those three endpoints are working just like we want them to right now. And again, these three endpoints are going to be used by our front end to load products, to load the shopping cart and to load individual product data.